And friends, our scripture lesson today is taken from the Gospel according to Mark, chapter 9, verses 30 through 37. They went on from there and passed through Galilee. He did not want anyone to know it, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, "The Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him, and 3 days after being killed, he will rise again." But they did not understand what he was saying and were afraid to ask him. Then they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the way?" But they were silent, for on the way they had argued with one another who was the greatest. He sat down, called the 12, and said to them, "Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all." Then he took a little child and put it among them, and taking it in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me." Well, friends, this is week 2 of our Level Up series, where we're talking about what it would take to move up rather than simply go back to the way things were as we continue to move forward through the end of this pandemic. Now, last week we talked about the idea that easy was not the goal, but sometimes easy is actually what we're going for, even if we don't realize it. There was a quote that I shared by Ed Catmull, who was one of the co-founders of Pixar Studios, and I'd like to repeat that quote and point out something different about it. What he said was, if you aren't experiencing failure, then you're making a far worse mistake. You are being driven by the desire to avoid it. I mean, he knew that if you are not experiencing failure, you're actually avoiding it because you're never trying, you're never pushing yourself. But this quote gets to the underlying motivation of your action. I mean, most people would never say that they're trying to avoid failure at all costs, because we understand that failure is a part of growth. Failure is a part of improving. And yet he's pointing out that even though you may think that you're not motivated by a desire to avoid failure, if you're not actually failing, then there's an underlying motivation of avoiding it that you may not be aware of. And I think that we're often in a situation where we have underlying motivations that we're not aware of. So I wonder if you actually understand what drives your desires, what drives your wants. I mean, sometimes I think we don't really know why we want what we believe we want. Sometimes we don't know why we think certain things are right or certain things ought to be done that way. I mean, how often have you heard things like, "Well, that's the way it should be," and you go, well, why? And a person can't really give you a great answer about that, because sometimes we just absorb these things and we accept these things and we don't really examine these things. There's a story I have of a friend who had 2 kids, and the 2 kids had been very different growing up. One was very studious, very obedient, and ended up going to, one of the top universities, all those kinds of things. The other one wasn't a bad kid, but was more of a questioner, more rebellious, and ended up taking their own path and went to sort of a less standard college, that kind of thing. And then my friend reported that when his kids both reached their 20s, he was kind of surprised, because it was the studious, obedient one who seemed kind of lost. And it was the rebellious one who was thriving. And I said to my friend, I said, that doesn't actually surprise me at all, because the obedient, studious one had just been doing what other people told them to do, right? The teachers had an expectation, they took on the expectation and they performed. Parents, other authority figures had an expectation, they took on the expectation and they performed. The rebellious one had their own ideas. They questioned, they wondered why, they wondered how this would fit what they wanted to do. And when they got out of college and they were on their own, you had the rebellious one who was thriving because they were finally free to follow their own desires. And you had the obedient one who was a little bit lost because they didn't have that external force telling them this is what you need to do, this is what you need to be about, this is the goal you ought to have. See, I think sometimes we hit that point in our own lives where we don't really understand the things that we think are our goals, but we simply accept them because we were told that that's the way it's supposed to be, or taught that that was the way it was supposed to be. And even if we think it's our own idea, even if we think it's our own preferences, sometimes I think we don't really understand what's driving us. But we need to understand what drives us so that we can deal with it. We can evaluate whether it's something good or something that's maybe less good that needs to be corrected. Our story in the Gospel of Mark this week begins with Jesus' disciples being taught, and it says they didn't really understand what they were being taught, but they go along the road and they're having an argument about who was the greatest. And I've always actually wondered, why did they care? What would it get them? What's actually going on inside them that they think it matters? How did Jesus ever indicate to them that this was even a question that should matter to them? But somehow, I think they just think that it matters and that they should worry about it. And so they do. Jesus tries to teach them, but they're not always the easiest bunch to teach. So Jesus tries to teach them, and he says to them, look, whoever wants to be first must be last of all. This is his first attempt at teaching them this lesson, and I am certainly not sure that they get it. I think they've had trouble understanding this all along, and I think they may misunderstand what Jesus is saying, because I can certainly imagine them saying, okay, well then the goal is to be last. But here's the truth. Racing to be last in order to be first is still racing to be first, right? It's like being proud of how humble you are. That's not exactly how it works. And yet sometimes those internal contradictions are what we have to face if we're really honest about our goals. Sometimes we have these internal contradictions that we need to face if we're looking at whether goals actually matter. So Jesus, I think, senses this and somehow tries a different tack with them and says, how about this as an example that you can see? He takes a child and sets it before them, holds the child in his arms and says, whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. He gives them this example with a visual aid. But here's what I think is really important about this. It's what is meant by the word welcome. See, I think sometimes that we think of welcome in terms of hospitality, and hospitality is obligation, okay? Instead, the word welcome in the Greek is this word dekamai. And this word dekamai means to graciously receive. It's not actually about what you do. It's about receiving from. In other words, it's about your attitude in seeing this child and seeing the situation. So what would it mean to graciously receive the child? It's not just about being nice to the child. It's about appreciating the child. It's not a matter of obligation. It's about seeing the worth in the child, appreciating what the child brings. It's about valuing the child. It's not about you. And I think that one of the things we need to remember as we consider the goals that we may have for our lives is that the best goals that we have are goals that are appreciated for their own value. See, too often we set goals that are functional to ourselves. I want to achieve this. I want to get that promotion. I want to, be recognized in whatever way. And the goal is actually functional for us, as opposed to being a goal that can be that stands on its own, that gets you outside yourself, that gives you satisfaction because it is something worthy on its own. A person that I've quoted many times in sermons, because I think he's such a wonderful thinker, is a man named Simon Sinek. And if you remember him or you've seen him elsewhere, you may have, because his career really took off because of a TED Talk that he gave. And this TED Talk had the title, Start With Why. I'm sure many of you have seen it. The TED Talk itself has been viewed 56 million times. It's one of the most viewed TED Talks in TED's history. And when he was talking about start with why, he first had to explain what why is. And yes, his definition of why began with the things that you would expect. Your why is your purpose in life. Your why is why you get out of bed in the morning. Your why is what motivates you. But then he said there was one more component of why, which I think is perhaps one of the most important components of your why, and it's this: why should anyone care? See, if it doesn't matter to the world, it's not worthy of your life. A worthy goal can't be something that only you care about, because it won't be big enough. Your life has to be more than about you, because your life comes to an end. Your life is contained. Your life here on earth is finite. And we want to live for things that are beyond that are bigger than that. See, Jesus' purpose, Jesus' why, is the ultimate in big. See, what he keeps talking about is not about being great. It's not about being first. What he keeps talking about is that the Son of Man is to be betrayed, and they will kill him, and 3 days after being killed, he will rise again. His goal was about humanity, salvation, the defeat of death. And that made everything worth it. He had the big enough why to devote his life to. A why that certainly answers the question, why should anyone care? The why was something I care about, you care about, that we all should care about. His why is the central reason why the church exists. And it is when your why is big enough that you can have actual satisfaction when you achieve it. See, life satisfaction is found in your true purposes, purposes that matter. And so if all the things that you talk about, all of your whys, all of your goals are actually undergirded by a why that's self-serving, by a why that's really about you, it won't be satisfying at the end of the day. And the saddest thing that I see is not someone who fails to achieve their goals. The saddest thing I see is someone who achieves their goals and realizes it wasn't worth it. And I use the word purposes plural here because you can have more than one. I think you can have a why for a season of your life. You can achieve that why, and then it's not as if your life is over. You move on to the next true purpose. But at each point in your life, you have a why. And you have a why that's bigger than you. And you analyze your actual motivations to realize that a proper why, a proper goal, a proper purpose is not fundamentally self-serving, but rather it's fundamentally about something bigger than you. And it may not take your entire life to achieve it. That's why there's a plural. Because you may have a why for a season of your life, achieve it, realize you did something with that portion of your life that was bigger than you and meant something, and then you find a new why, a new purpose. One of the other dangers that we can have is that we think that we've run out of reasons, run out of purpose once we achieve the one that we're on. But I don't think that's true at all. I think we can have multiple ones. We can have certainly ones that are a part of our careers and ones that are a part of our retirement. We can have a purpose that is there when you are in the phase of parenting, and a purpose that arises when you've empty nested. We can have more than one. But the most important thing is to make sure that at each point, that purpose, that why, that reason you get out of bed in the morning matters to someone other than you. To sum up, so far what we've talked about is that your why, your purpose, shouldn't be chosen just because it's easy. The easy path doesn't mean it's the right path. And the right path leads to something bigger than you. Bigger than you. Because it's not about you. And we'll talk about how to get there next week in week 3 of Level Up.